Hi, friends. How are you doing today? I really hope that you guys are having the day that you deserve. My name's Carly Ramsey, and you are listening to the serial Zodiac. I'm so excited that you're here and that you're wanting to listen to this episode. So, with that being said, I don't want to lollygag on too long, but I will be here for you guys every other Thursday to push you out new content. So, that being said, let's jump right into today's story. Thanks, guys. Warning: this podcast episode contains explicit language, mature themes, and thought provoking content. Listener discretion is advised, and it's not suitable for minors or the faint of heart. For the longest time, everybody thought that Dean Corll was a nice young man. Track record was perfect, he was great with school, and aside from a few little blunders here and there, nobody could suspect him of any foul play. But then things began to change. Dean got involved in a series of crimes that would leave even the toughest hearts in shock. He targeted frail, gullible minds and then led them to their deaths in the most horrifying ways possible. This is the story of Dean Arnold Corll. All right. Now, you know that diving into the zodiac and crime can be quite the rabbit hole. But let's entertain this idea for a moment, shall we? Dean Arnold Corll, born on December 24th, 1939, was a Capricorn. Now, Capricorns are often known for their ambition, discipline, and practicality. They can be very goal oriented and focused individuals. Now, imagine those traits taken to the extreme, like a dark twist on ambition and control. Corll's crimes were methodical, planned with chilling precision. It's as if that Capricorn determination and focus were channeled into something absolutely sinister. Capricorns are also known for being secretive and reserved, which could have contributed to Corll's ability to keep his crimes hidden for so long. But hey, at the end of the day, astrology is just one piece of the puzzle, right? Just a little food for thought. Now, his parents, Mary Emma Robinson and Arnold Edwin Corll, had quite a rocky relationship. While Dean's father was known to be strict with the kids, his mother was very protective of her sons. Unfortunately, their marriage was filled with frequent arguments, and they ended up getting a divorce in 1946 when Dean was just 7 years old. Now, after the divorce, Mary decided to sell their family home and move to Memphis, Tennessee with Dean and his younger brother, Stanley Wayne Corll. The reason? Well, Arnold, their father, had joined the United States Air Force, and Mary wanted to make sure her sons could still stay connected with him. Moving to Memphis meant a big change for the family. They settled into a trailer home to start this new chapter. And despite their parents splitting up, it was important for Mary that Dean and Stanley kept a relationship with their father, who was now serving in the Air Force. Moving closer to where Arnold was stationed made it easier for the family to stay connected. Dean was always known as a shy and serious child. He wasn't the type to run around with a big group of friends, even though But even though he kept to himself, he always showed genuine concern for others' well being. When Dean was just 7 years old, he was hit with an undiagnosed case of rhythmic fever. And it wasn't until 1950 that doctors discovered that he had a heart murmur. Now, this health issue meant that Dean had to steer clear of PE classes in school to avoid overexertion. After their parents split, things were a bit up in the air for a while. But in 1950, Mary and Arnold decided to give their marriage another go. They remarried and moved the family to Pasadena, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston. However, this reunion didn't last long. By 1953, they were back to square one and divorced again. Mary ended up keeping custody of Dean and Stanley, and they still managed to keep in touch with their dad. Following her second divorce, Mary got married to a traveling clock salesman named Jake West. The newly blended family moved to Vidor, Texas, where Dean's half sister, Joyce Janine, was born in 1955. It was here that Mary and Jake set up a small family candy company right out of their garage. Now, this candy business was a family affair. Dean and Stanley had to pull their weight while juggling school. They were responsible for running the candy making machines and packing the products. Jake took care of selling the candy on his sales routes, often traveling to Houston, where a lot of their product was sold. Throughout his high school years, from 1954 to 1958, at Vidor High School, Dean was considered a well behaved student who managed to pull off satisfactory grades. He didn't hang out in big groups, preferred his own company, and although he wasn't the most outgoing guy, Dean did date girls in his teenage years from time to time. His main passion during this time was playing the trombone in the brass band. After graduating from Vidor High School in the summer of 1958, Dean's family decided to move closer to Houston. Now, this move was strategic because it put their candy business right where the action was. They opened up a brand new shop called Pecan Prince and named it after their signature product. In 1960, Mary asked Dean to move to Indiana to live with his grandmother, who was widowed at the time. During his stay in Indiana, Dean got pretty close to a local girl. She even popped the question and asked him to marry her, but Dean turned her down on the marriage proposal in 1962. Now, after 2 years in Indiana, Dean headed back to Houston in 1962 to lend a hand with the family candy business, now located in Houston Heights. He set up his apartment above the shop, making it easier to manage work and life. But Mary wasn't done with changes. In 1963, she divorced Jake West and launched a new candy business called Corll Candy Company. And she handed over the reins to Dean, naming him vice president. His brother Stanley also got in on the action, becoming the secretary treasurer of the family firm. However, trouble had started to brew. A male teenager working at the company came up to Mary and complained about Dean making unwanted sexual advances towards him. In response to this, instead of asking Dean what was up, she simply fired the teenager. Now, Dean was drafted into the United States Army on August 10th of 1964, and he got his start in basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana. After that, he was sent over to Fort Benning, Georgia, where he trained to become a radio repairman. And his final destination was Fort Hood, Texas, where he was permanently stationed. According to the official military records, Dean's time in the Army was pretty smooth. No blemishes on his record, just steady service. But here's the thing: Dean reportedly wasn't a fan of military life. He even applied for a hardship discharge because he claimed he was needed back at his family's candy business. Surprisingly, the Army granted his request and he was honorably discharged on June 11th of 1965 after 10 months of service. Once he was out of the Army, Dean returned to Houston Heights and slid back into his role as vice president of Corll Candy Company. His stepfather, who had kept ownership of the family's old candy business, Pecan Prince, after divorcing Dean's mom in 1963, was now his business rival. Competition between the two candy businesses was pretty fierce. Just like in his teenage years, Dean cranked up the hours at the candy shop to meet the growing demand for his family sweets. And by 1965, the Coral Candy Company had moved to 22nd Street, right across from Helms Elementary School. Dean had a reputation for handing out free candy to the local kids, especially teenage boys. Now, this earned him the nickname the Candyman and sometimes Pied Piper. The candy factory became a hangout spot, especially because Dean had a pool table set up in the back, and it was a place where employees and local youths would gather to shoot some pool and hang out. Dean was known for being a bit flirtatious with some of the teenage male workers, which didn't go unnoticed by those around him. After leaving the Army, it seemed like Dean went through some personal discoveries. He confided in close friends that it was during his time in the service that he first realized that he was gay and had his first experiences with other men. People who knew him noticed a change in his behavior, especially around teenage boys, when he came back to Houston after his Army stint. Back in 1967, Dean struck up a friendship with a 12-year-old named David Owen Brooks, who was in the sixth grade and wore glasses. David was one of those kids who got free candy from Dean's candy shop. He became one of Dean's many youthful buddies, hanging out with Dean and a bunch of other teenage boys who gathered behind the candy factory. David even joined Dean on regular trips to South Texas beaches with other young folks. David later said that Dean was the first adult male who didn't make fun of his appearance, which made him feel good. Whenever Dean Whenever David needed cash, Dean was quick to help out, giving him money whenever he asked. This support made David start to see Dean as a father figure. And soon, however, David and Dean got into a sexual relationship after Dean insisted on it. David's parents were divorced. His dad lived in Houston and his mom had moved to Beaumont, a city about 85 miles east of Houston. And in 1970, when David was 15, he left Waltrip High School and went to live with his mom in Beaumont. Whenever he visited his dad in Houston, he would also drop by and see Dean, who let him stay at his apartment whenever he wanted. By the end of that year, David had moved back to Houston and began to see Dean's place as his second home. By the time David dropped out of high school, Dean's mother and half sister Joyce had moved to Colorado after her third marriage ended. And Candy Company shut down in June of 1968. Even though she spoke with her eldest son on the phone often, his mom never saw him again. After the candy company closed, Dean got a job as an electrician at the Houston Lighting and Power Company, where he tested electrical relay systems. He stuck with his job until the day he died. Between 1970 and 1973, Dean killed at least 28 victims. All of them were males, aged 13 to 20, with most being in their mid teens. Now, he usually targeted victims from Houston Heights, a low income neighborhood northwest of downtown Houston. And Dean had the help of two teenage accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, in most of these abductions. So some victims were friends of Dean's accomplices, and others were people that Dean knew personally before he abducted and murdered them. Now, two of his victims, Billy Balsh and Gregory Malley Winkle, were even former employees of Coral Candy Company. Dean would lure his victims into one of his vehicles, a Ford Ecoline van, or a Plymouth GTX, or a 1969 Chevrolet Corvette that he bought for David in early 1971. He'd tempt them with offers of parties or rides and then drive them to his house. And there he'd get them drunk or high until they passed out, trick them into wearing handcuffs, or just grab them by force. And once subdued, he'd strip them naked and tie them to his bed or a plywood board on the wall. Afterward, Dean would wrap their bodies in plastic sheeting and bury them in various spots, like a rented boat shed in Southwest Houston, or a beach on the Bolivar Peninsula, a woodland lake near Sam Rayburn, or a beach in Jefferson County. Also, side note, guys, everyone just heard me giggle. It wasn't a giggle because this was funny. It was a giggle because this escalated very quickly. He went from sleeping with men to murdering them and hiding them on beaches. It's very, very fast escalation. It's not funny. It's a nervous laugh. It's a thing that I'm working on. But anyway, in some cases, Dean forced his victims to call or write their parents to explain their absences, trying to ease their worries. And he also kept keepsakes from his victims, usually keys. Now, during these years of abducting and murdering, Dean moved around a lot, but until he settled in Pasadena in the spring of 1973, he always lived in or near Houston Heights. His crimes were horrific, and he managed to evade capture for years despite living so close to where he committed his heinous acts. Now, let's get into the depths of who he murdered and how he did it. So, back in September of 1970, a chilling series of events began when Dean committed his first known murder. The victim was Jeffrey Connon, an 18-year-old college freshman who vanished while hitchhiking with a friend from University of Texas to his parents' house in Houston. Connon was last seen getting dropped off alone at a street corner near uptown Houston. Now, here's where it gets mysterious. Dean was living in the Harold Turboff apartments at the time. And do you think he accepted a ride from Dean, not knowing what was to come? On August 10th, 1973, David finally led the police to Connon's body buried at High Island Beach. Imagine the forensic sciences uncovering the details. Conan died from asphyxiation due to manual strangulation with a cloth gag in his mouth. They found his body beneath a large boulder, wrapped in plastic and completely bound with nylon cord. Now, get this. Dean promised David a car to keep quiet about Conan's murder, and David accepted. Later on, Dean even bought him a green Corvette. Can you believe that? It was after this that Dean told David the truth about killing Conan and offered him cash for every boy he could lure to Dean's apartment. Now, on December 13th of 1970, David lured two 14-year-olds, James Glass and Danny Yates, from a religious rally to Dean's apartment. They were both strangled and buried in a boat shed. Then, about 6 weeks later, on January 30th, 1971, Dean and David encountered two teenage brothers, Donald and Jerry Waldrop. What a bizarre coincidence. These brothers were enticed into Dean's van, strangled, and buried in the same boat shed. Now, between March and May 1971, Dean abducted and killed three more victims from Houston Heights, each time with David involved. It's heartbreaking to imagine the parents' frantic search for their missing sons, like Hillquist and Winkle, even Elmer Wayne Henley, a friend of one of the boys, tried to reassure the parents, but tragically, the killings continued. Now, in most of these killings, Dean would sexually assault the victims before he murdered them, which hinted at there being sexual motive behind his actions. However, things were only going to get worse. In 1971, David introduced Elmer Wayne Henley to Dean Corll during winter. At first, Elmer was probably thinking he might be Dean's next victim. But here's where it got crazy. Dean actually saw potential in Elmer to be his partner in crime. He offered Elmer $200 for each boy he could bring to his place. Can you imagine that? Now, Elmer kind of brushed off this offer for a few months, but he stayed in touch with Dean. But why would he keep in touch with him if he sensed that something wasn't right? Deep down, things had probably changed, and soon Elmer started seeing Dean as this strange mentor figure. Then, in early 1972, Elmer was facing some serious money issues and problems with his family. So he decided to take Dean's deal. Do you think Elmer made the right choice, or should he have stayed away from Dean altogether? It's a tough call. The first time Elmer joined in on an abduction was when Dean was living on Sculler Street. They picked up a boy at 11th and Studwood, luring him with promises of smoking weed. Once they got this poor kid to Dean's place, Elmer did this crazy thing where he cuffed his own hands behind his back and then tricked the boy into putting on the handcuffs. Then, a month later, they ran into this guy named Frank Aguilera, and Elmer invited him to hang out for beer and weed at Dean's place, and then Dean flipped out on Aguilera and cuffed him, planning to assault and kill him. Elmer tried to talk Dean down, but ended up helping bury poor Aguilera at High Island Beach. Now, you'd think after that Elmer would back off, right? Well, you would be wrong. On April 20th, they grabbed Elmer's friend, Mark Scott. This time, Scott tried to fight back, even going for a knife, but he surrendered when he saw Elmer aiming a gun at him. Scott met the same tragic fate as Aguilera: torture, strangulation, and burial at High Island Beach. And Elmer didn't stop there. David and Elmer got even more twisted during the murders at Sculler Sculler Street. He was fascinated by how people handled murder. Now, before Dean moved out on June 26th, Elmer helped with kidnapping and killing Billy Balch and Johnny DeLome. Elmer even strangled Balch and shot DeLome in the head after he begged for mercy. Now, together with David and Elmer, they lured a 19-year-old named William Reidinger to the house. Reidinger en- endured torture and abuse by Dean on a plywood board. David later claimed he somehow convinced Dean to let Reidinger go, but it didn't end there. Another wild incident at Scholar Street was when Elmer knocked David out when he entered the house. Dean then tied David to his bed and assaulted him before finally releasing him. And can you believe that David kept assisting Dean even after that trauma? Now, what was driving him to stay involved? Your guess is good as mine. After leaving Scholar Street, Dean moved to an apartment at Westcott Towers. During that summer in 1972, Dean believed Dean is believed to have killed two or more victims. He killed a 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, last seen leaving a party in the Heights, and Stephen was brutally bludgeoned and strangled and then buried in a boat shed. And then a month later, 19-year-old Roy Button was abducted on his way to work, gagged, bound, shot twice, and buried in the same boat shed. David and Elmer didn't mention these victims, and their identities were only confirmed much later in 2011. Then on October 3rd, 1972, Elmer and David encountered two teenagers from the Heights: Wally J. Simuxon and Richard. Oh my gosh, guys, I'm so bad at pronouncing names. And Richard Hembry. They were lured to Dean's apartment, and things turned deadly. Simuxon managed to make a distress call to his mom before they were both strangled and buried together. Such a tragic end for these young guys. And the horrors continue. Like the case of 18-year-old Willard Branch, found gagged and emasculated, buried in the same boat shed. In total, at least 10 teenagers between 13 and 19 years old were murdered from March to November of 1972. 5 were buried at High Island Beach, and 5 inside the boat shed. Then Dean moved again, this time to Witt Road on Houston's Spring Branch district. Within weeks of moving, he took the life of 17-year-old Joseph Lyles, who knew both Dean and David. Joseph lived on the same street as David, adding another layer of horror to this story. And Dean kept moving, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable tragedy. There was a significant break in Dean's killing spree between February and June of 1973. During this time, he was dealing with a medical condition called hydrocele, which likely slowed him down a bit. Elmer actually moved away to Mount Pleasant around the time of one of the murders, almost like he was trying to distance himself from Dean. Now, do you think Elmer was starting to have second thoughts about their partnership? I don't know. But then from June onwards, things took a darker turn. Dean's killing spree kicked into high gear while he was living on Lamar Drive. Elmer and David later testified about the increased brutality of some of these murders. Elmer described it like Dean was consumed by a bloodlust. On June 4th, Elmer and Dean abducted 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence, who endured 3 days of torture before Dean strangled him and buried him at Lake Sam Rayburn. Less than 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn suffered a similar fate, abducted, strangled, and buried at the same location. By July 6th, Elmer was attending driving school and met 15-year-old Homer Luis Garcia, who tragically met his end in Dean's bathtub. And then on July 12th, 17-year-old John Sellers suffered a similar fate after being bound, shot, and buried at High Island Beach. After David got married to his pregnant fiancee in July of 1973, Elmer became Dean's main partner in crime. They abducted and murdered 3 youth from the Heights area between July 19th and 25th. Elmer mentioned these were the only abductions he did without David. Now, on August 3rd, 1973, Dean committed his final murder, targeting 13-year-old James Stratton Damala from South Houston. David and Dean lured Dramala while he was riding his bike, pretending to collect glass bottles. Dramala faced torture, strangulation, and burial in the boat shed. David later recalled Dramala as a small blonde boy. It's heart-wrenching. After this murder, Dean's gruesome spree came to an end. On the evening of August 7th, 1973, 17-year-old Elmer invited 20-year-old Timothy Cordell Curley to a party at Dean's place in Pasadena. Timothy, who was Dean's intended next victim, agreed to go. David wasn't around at the time, and when they got to Dean's house, they started sniffing paint fumes and drinking until midnight, planning to return soon. Elmer and Timothy then headed back to Houston Heights, parking Timothy's car near Elmer's place. They got out, and Elmer, hearing noises from his friend Rhonda Louise Williams' house, walked over. Rhonda, nursing a sprained ankle from a fight with her drunk dad, joined Elmer and Timothy in Timothy's Volkswagen. They then drove back to Dean's place in Pasadena around 3 a.m. on August 8th, 1973, and Dean was livid that Elmer brought a girl to his house, telling him he ruined everything. Elmer explained that Rhonda had fought with her dad and didn't want to go home. Dean seemed to calm down and offered them beer and marijuana. They all drank and smoked, with Elmer and Timothy sniffing paint while Dean watched closely. After a couple of hours, they all passed out. Elmer woke up to find himself face down, handcuffed by Dean. His mouth was taped shut and his ankles were bound. Timothy and Rhonda were beside him, also bound and gagged, with Timothy naked. When Elmer woke up, Dean took the tape off his mouth. Elmer tried to reason with Dean, but Dean was furious for Elmer bringing a girl and had planned to kill them all after assaulting Timothy. Dean kicked Rhonda before dragging Elmer to the kitchen, threatening him with a pistol. Elmer promised to help if Dean released him. After some discussion, Dean untied Elmer and carried Timothy and Rhonda into the bedroom, tying them to opposite sides of the torture board. Dean told Timothy about his intentions, while Elmer continued sniffing paint. Dean handed Elmer a knife and ordered him to strip Rhonda. Elmer started cutting her clothes while Dean assaulted Timothy. Both Timothy and Rhonda were awake by then. Timothy was struggling, and Rhonda asked Elmer if it was real. Elmer confirmed, and Rhonda asked him if he would do something. Then Elmer asked Dean if he could take Rhonda to another room, but Dean ignored him. Elmer grabbed Dean's pistol, telling him to stop. Surprisingly, Dean approached and asked Elmer to kill him. Elmer shot Dean in the forehead, but the bullet didn't penetrate completely. Dean kept coming towards Elmer, who fired two more shots, hitting Dean in the shoulder. Dean stumbled out, and Elmer shot him three more times in the back. And that's when he collapsed and died. After shooting Dean, Elmer and Timothy cried and thanked him for saving his life. Elmer freed Timothy and Rhonda, and they dressed and discussed their next steps. Elmer suggested leaving, but Timothy insisted they call the police. Elmer found the Pasadena Police Department's number in Dean's phone directory, and they made the call. On August 8th, 1974, at 8:24 a.m., Elmer made a frantic call to the Pasadena Police Department. Speaking urgently to an operator named Bill Malines, he blurted out that they had to come down there quickly because he just killed a man. Elmer provided the address, 2020 Lamar Drive in Pasadena, and they waited nervously on Dean's porch with Timothy and Rhonda for the police to arrive. While they waited, Elmer casually mentions Timothy that he had killed someone by shooting them 4 or 5 times before. Soon after, a patrol car from the Pasadena Police Department pulled up at 2020 Lamar Drive. The officer noticed the three teens sitting on the porch and spotted a .22 caliber pistol nearby on the driveway. Elmer stepped forward, identified himself as the caller, and told the officer that Dean's body was inside the house. The officer secured the pistol, placed Elmer, Rhonda, and Timothy in the patrol car, and entered the bungalow. Inside, the officer discovered Dean's body lying in the hallway. Returning to the car, the officer read Elmer his Miranda rights, and he responded by shouting that he doesn't care who knows about it because he has to get it off his chest. Later, Timothy revealed to the detectives that before the police arrived, Elmer said something very disturbing to him. He had told him that if Timothy hadn't been his friend, he could have gotten $200 for him. However, now that the case was out in the open, a deep investigation into the matter and even more secrets began to emerge. To be continued. Come back for part 2. And sign up for my email list. And don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel either. Thank you so much for being a loyal listener. And until next time, toodaloo.